in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Secretary of State of the United States of America. Again, to our briefers, thank you. And thank you for keeping our focus on what's really at stake here, and that is the human element of our discussions. It's easy to get caught up in numbers and statistics and big concepts, but ultimately it comes down to people. It comes down to children. So I thank you for that focus, as well as on practical solutions to the problem before us. So to all three of our briefers, again, you have powerfully illustrated the challenge before us, but even more important, you've given us very good ideas for actually how to address that challenge. Last September, President Biden told the General Assembly, and I quote, "In every country in the world, if parents cannot feed their children, nothing else matters." In some ways, it's as simple and as stark as that. Too many families are experiencing the overwhelming urgency, the consequence of an unprecedented global food crisis that, as we've heard, has been fueled by climate, by COVID as well, and, as we're discussing today, by conflict. Hunger and conflict are inexorably linked. Scarce resources heighten tensions between communities and nations. Warring parties weaponize food to subjugate local populations. Indeed, conflict is the largest driver of food insecurity, with violence and unrest pushing 117 million people into extreme deprivation last year. In Sudan, the fighting has disrupted the summer planting season and driven up the cost of food. In Myanmar, where 1 in 5 people is severely undernourished, the military regime is making the problem worse to tighten its grip, including blocking aid convoys. Deteriorating conditions prevent the safe return of nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees who fled their homeland and who now live in Bangladesh on rations that are down to about 27 cents per day. In Yemen, some families have reported and resorted to boiling leaves to stay alive. They call it famine food. Unless the world acts, Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Somalia could all experience famine next year. And again, I ask each of us, pause for that for a moment. Think about what that actually means. Imagine just for a minute if this was your child, your son, your daughter. You heard the compelling description of what that actually is all about. And I hope, if nothing else, having that image in our minds, tying it to our own lives and experiences, will be some added motivation for us to act. Since January 2021, the United States has provided more than $17.5 billion to address famine and food insecurity. In 2021 and 2022, we convened this Council to focus on the intersection between hunger and conflict. We chaired last year's Food Security Ministerial, where we joined over 36 countries in issuing a global roadmap, committing to get food to those in need and to build greater resilience for the future. To date, more than 100 countries have signed that pledge and begun to take concrete steps to actually implement it. But as this crisis ramps up, so must our efforts. This Council is charged with maintaining international peace and security. And we simply cannot preserve peace and security without strengthening food security. Each of us has a responsibility to act. This morning, for the first time in 3 years, this Council has unanimously put conflict, hunger and famine, as well as climate change, at the center of its agenda. This is a noteworthy and welcome step. Now, let's harness the momentum to further combat food insecurity and famine around the world, to turn what we're talking about into concrete actions. 5 years ago, as you've heard, this Council adopted Resolution 2417, emphasizing that the intentional starvation of civilians may constitute a war crime. Today, we can build on these efforts. Nearly 90 countries, including the United States, have already signed a new joint communique that we drafted and circulated, committing to end the use of famine, starvation, and food as weapons of war. Hunger must not be weaponized. I urge all member states to join this communique. We also must significantly increase aid to tackle extreme hunger and to avert famine. Last year, governments and private donors made record contributions, providing direct relief, equipping farmers with fertilizer, using satellite imagery to maximize yields. Donations for the World Food Program jumped 48%. The United States alone provided more than $7.2 billion, funding roughly half of the World Food Program's budget. These and other efforts helped the world narrowly avoid famine last year. But this year, as we've heard, the World Food Program estimates that it has to spend $25 billion to deliver relief to 171 million people. To date, countries have funded only $4.5 billion. In other words, 18% of what's required. The cost of that shortfall will be measured in growth stunted and in lives lost. While we welcome smaller countries punching above their weight, the world's largest economies should be the world's largest donors. For member states that consider themselves global leaders, this is your chance to prove it. All of us can dig deeper. But, of course, we know, while it is necessary, it is not sufficient to meet immediate needs. We must also increase agricultural productivity. We've got to invest in adaptation. We have to build greater resilience to future shocks, especially in regions that are affected by conflict. Around the world, farmers confront soaring temperatures, eroding soil, disappearing groundwater. That reduces yields. It makes crops less nutritious. By 2050, climate change could cut output by as much as 30%, even as global food demand increases by over 50%. So we have a planet that's heading in the coming decades to a population of as much as 10 billion people, with demand going up in accordance, and yet supply is actually declining, not increasing. So as challenging, as urgent as the situation is now, we can also see what's coming if we don't take the necessary steps to address it. Mitigating climate impacts is central to the United States Feed the Future initiative, a public-private partnership to strengthen food systems, to expand social safety nets, to enhance nutrition in 40 countries around the world. We've devoted over $1 billion every year to this effort. Last year, we expanded the program to 8 more target countries in Africa. To build on this work, we've now launched what we call Vision for Adopted Crops and Soils in February, alongside the African Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The shorthand, VAX, through this program, we're identifying the most nutritious indigenous African crops, assessing how climate change will likely affect them, and investing in breeding the most climate resilient and most resilient varieties, as well as improving the soil that they'll grow in. This focus on the quality of the seeds and the quality of the soil can have a powerful impact on sustainable agricultural productivity throughout Africa. Today, I'm also announcing $362 million more to tackle the drivers of food insecurity and to enhance resilience in Haiti and 11 African countries, like getting nutritious food to pregnant women and helping farmers grow hardier and more diverse crops. The United States will continue to do our part, but this is, by definition, a global challenge. It demands global resources. And we'll be looking to governments, to companies, to philanthropies to help us continue to improve nutrition and invest in sustainable and resilient food systems. Finally, we must address Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the resulting assault on the global food system. This past year, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey, delivered over 32 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs to the world. Wheat exports alone were the equivalent of 18 billion loaves of bread. 18 billion loaves of bread. Keep in mind, this initiative never should have been necessary in the first place. It only was necessary because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its blockade of Ukrainian ports. But the initiative produced concrete, demonstrable, powerful results in making sure that these food products could continue to get to world markets, going to those who needed it. And let's be very clear about who benefited from this initiative. Over half the food products exported through this effort and 2/3 of the wheat went to developing countries. These shipments helped to lower global food prices for everyone by roughly a quarter since Russia's full-scale invasion. Since Russia pulled out of the arrangement on July 17th, ignoring the world's appeals, grain prices have risen by more than 8% around the world. Kenya's foreign ministry called Russia's move, and I quote, a stab in the back. The Kremlin claims that it tore up the deal because international sanctions were restricting its agricultural exports. In reality, sanctions explicitly exclude food and fertilizer. In fact, at the time it abandoned the initiative, Russia was exporting more grain at higher prices than ever before. And what has Russia's response been to the world's distress and outrage? Bombing Ukrainian granaries, mining port entrances, threatening to attack any vessel in the Black Sea, no matter its flag, no matter its cargo. These actions are consistent with Russia's decision last month to block the reauthorization of critical cross-border humanitarian assistance to Syria, a country where, after February's devastating earthquake, 12 million people don't have enough to eat. The United States is prepared to renew efforts to mandate this vital lifeline if the United Nations and Syria cannot find a way forward. We also very much appreciate Turkey and others working to reinstate the grain deal. Every member of this Council, every member of the United Nations should tell Moscow, enough. Enough using the Black Sea as blackmail. Enough treating the world's most vulnerable people as leverage. Enough of this unjustified, unconscionable war. Strengthening food security is essential to realizing the vision of the United Nations Charter, to save generations from the scourge of war and reaffirm the dignity and worth of every single human being. That hope is embodied in one of the statues outside this building of a figure fulfilling the biblical directive to beat swords into plowshares. These words of Scripture are not yet in reach, but we can at least commit not to use our swords to destroy others' plows. We can deliver life-saving aid to those in urgent need. We can ensure that people around the globe are fed now and for years to come. If we do that, if we build a healthier, more stable, more peaceful world for all, we will have at least begun to live up to the responsibility entrusted to us, entrusted to this Council, entrusted to this institution. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Dora bint Mohammed Al-Kibi, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for convening this important meeting today, and to our briefers for bringing their valuable perspectives to our discussion. We align ourselves with the statement made by Oman on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council. More than 700 million people are going hungry around the world, while a third of the world's population, almost 2.5 billion people, had restricted access to food last year. As we have heard from our briefers, there is no single reason for global food insecurity, Though the reasons for it are complex, the human cost is plain to see. 45 million children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. Millions of people are driven to undertake dangerous, irregular migration journeys. There is increased sexual and gender-based violence. We know that food insecurity contributes to conflict and instability, while the reverse is also true. As intricately linked as they are, within the Council and globally, we cannot afford not to act. Today, there are 3 points I wish to make to this effect. First, food insecurity is preventable. Preventing food insecurity and famine is a political choice. Bringing food insecurity to an end is a collective endeavor. No one should experience famine. In conflict, international humanitarian law is clear. Parties to armed conflict must take constant care to spare the objects necessary to produce food and drinking water, and they must never target civilian objects. There is not only a moral but a legal duty to uphold these norms, and we call upon all parties to conflict to strictly adhere to their responsibilities. It is also important that those in a position to support and facilitate life-saving humanitarian efforts do so. For its part, the UAE has contributed more than $1.4 billion in assistance in over the past 5 years to address food insecurity. Conflicts, such as in Ukraine, can contribute to global food insecurity. Its knock-on effects in world markets mean that those living far beyond any battlefield often struggle to feed their families, especially in the Middle East and parts of Africa, where countries rely heavily on grain imports. In these instances, we must support national strategies and develop innovative approaches and partnerships that meet the scale of the challenge. Second, ensuring global food security requires all hands on deck. We must deepen international partnerships and make the most of multilateral fora at both the international and regional levels. We saw the potential of multilateral efforts to reduce food insecurity through the establishment of Black Sea Grain Initiative. The rise in wheat prices since the agreement came to an end, and let me reiterate that the UAE is deeply saddened by this development and is telling of a global importance of such initiative. A spirit of ambition and global collaboration is also needed to tackle a growing driver of food insecurity, climate change. July was the hottest month on record. As such, we must see unity of purpose at the highest levels to reverse this disturbing trend by taking tangible measures to prevent the rise of temperatures above 1.5 degrees and ensuring climate adaptation and mitigation measures are firmly in place, particularly in fragile areas. All hands on deck truly means all hands and all voices. Those disproportionately affected by food insecurity and climate change, in particular women and youth, must be front and center when designing responses. Recognizing the disparity is not enough. We must encourage their full, equal, and meaningful participation. Third, and we need novel approaches to this challenge. We commend the dedicated efforts of governments, international, regional organizations, private sectors, actors, and humanitarian groups, and their significant achievements in this field. Yet, food insecurity continues to rise. If we limit ourselves to the same approaches, we will not turn this tide. So it's time to expand our approaches. Public-private partnerships are vital to tackling this huge challenge. The UAE is actively engaged in public-private partnerships, such as the Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiative's annual 1 billion meal campaign. And in 2021, the UAE and the United States launched the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate to catalyze innovation in climate-smart agriculture. It now works with over 50 government partners, the private sector and civil society, and has raised more than $13 billion to accelerate transformational change. Mr. President, The world cannot maintain peace and security without one of the most basic needs for humanity. The trend we are witnessing is a testament to the need to redouble our efforts. It is my hope that we seize the opportunity of this meeting to take greater concerted action globally to overcome this challenge. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Alkebi for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kenji Yamada, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, Japan welcomes the issuance of the PRST and commends all the tireless work of you and your U.S. team, as well as the constructive effort made by each fellow member state. It is critical that the Council speak in one voice on its commitment to address conflict-induced food insecurity. Mr. President and colleagues, Japan is seriously concerned that a huge number of people are facing famine and other food insecurity caused by conflict and climate change. Food is a basic human need. Thus, it should not be weaponized at any time. Every day, we hear voices of food insecurity caused by man-made conflict. Japan deeply regrets Russia's decision to unilaterally terminate its participation in Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had allowed grain exports from Ukraine and contributed to global food security. Russia has wasted tremendous amounts of grain by attacking grain storage and loading terminals in Odessa and along the Danube. Meanwhile, Russia announced that it will replace Ukraine in supplying grains to African countries. We should not accept Russia's attempt to weaponize food to destroy grains in Ukraine while increasing its own exports. Japan strongly urges Russia to return to the international framework associated with the UN to resume grain exports from Ukraine in order to relieve food insecurity in the world. Japan also continued to support EU-led solidarity lanes, which works to ensure Ukraine can export grains. Mr. President and colleagues, the UN and this Council should play their roles in combating food security issues while exerting the influence and solidarity. Addressing famine and conflict-induced food insecurity requires not only short-term efforts such as the emergency food assistance, but also medium and long-term actions based on the concept of human security, such as strengthening the resilience of food systems. Efforts to prevent conflicts, which are root cause of food insecurity, is also important. In this context, Japan believes that it would be beneficial to reduce future humanitarian needs by addressing a comprehensive way through humanitarian development peace nexus approach. In conflict, it is crucial to protect vulnerable people such as women and children. In order to realize the provision of life-saving assistance for those vulnerable people, parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. Mr. President and colleagues, food security and humanitarian assistance have been top priority for Japan. We have a long history of providing various assistance and international cooperation, including humanitarian aid necessary for those suffering from famine and conflict-induced food insecurity. Japan has also spoken out about the necessity of humanitarian passage on Black Sea to ship grains from Ukraine just after Russia's aggression. Japan is proud to have issued the Hiroshima Statement for Resilient Global Food Security in May, together with countries representing various regions around the world. It can be a comprehensive guideline for responding to the immediate food security crisis and for establishing resilient agriculture and food system in the medium and long term. Before closing, allow me to touch upon the issue of famine and food insecurity in East Asia and beyond. In North Korea, it is reported that many people are suffering from severe hunger. On the other hand, North Korea is spending vast resources on unlawful nuclear and missile development by diverting critical needed resources away from its people at tremendous cost. Violating multiple UN Security Council resolutions, North Korea has been repeatedly launching ballistic missiles and threatening peace and stability in East Asia, even now. Mr. President and colleagues, it is extremely regrettable that the Security Council has not been able to take tangible actions on this matter. The Council must overcome its prolonged silence and take meaningful steps with a united voice. We sincerely ask for you, everyone, understanding and support. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Yamada for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Meggie Fino, Deputy Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the United States Presidency for convening this timely debate and welcome you, Secretary Blinken, in the chair. We're grateful to the United States for its coherence and continued action in keeping the focus on this issue of paramount importance for all of us, especially for those anywhere who continue to struggle to make ends meet. In this respect, we welcome the PRST proposed by the U.S. and adopted this morning as a timely reminder of the collective duty to put everything in place to ensure proper responses to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including malnutrition and famine. I also thank all three briefers for their insightful presentations and for presenting before us the most realistic needs required worldwide today. Food insecurity is a pressing global challenge, and today, more than ever, a range of colliding factors such as conflicts, climate change, underdevelopment, and macroeconomic shocks are threatening global food security worldwide. The number of people facing acute food insecurity has increased from 193 million in 2021 to 258 million in 2022. More than 250 million people faced acute hunger in 58 countries and territories last year. In 19 countries and territories, roughly 117 million people suffer from high levels of acute food insecurity due to conflict and insecurity. This has put a heavy toll on humanitarian interventions and food assistance efforts to meet the growing needs. Further, acute hunger, one step away from famine, is increasingly alarming and constitutes a threat not only to the communities and the populations concerned, but also to peace and security in many regions of the world. This is what is happening nowadays in Afghanistan, Haiti, the Sahel region, South Sudan, Sudan, Yemen, where populations face starvation in absence of urgent humanitarian intervention. This is what is happening in Syria. The Russian veto on the cross-border authorization of Bab al-Hawa, Syria, has endangered the life-saving aid and food security for over 4 million people in northwest Syria, leaving them to the mercy of a ruthless regime notoriously known for its brutality. The Russian withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative confirms a policy of weaponization of food and the use of famine as a bargaining chip to achieve political gains. But Russia did not stop there. With its daily bombardments of seaports targeting grain export facilities, a civilian infrastructure, Russia is committing crimes and is playing with the anxiety of millions, unsure to have food in the coming days and weeks. Moscow's promises to several African countries for modest amounts of free grain supplies, ridiculous compared to the actual needs, are part of its efforts to capitalize on the collapse of the BSGI and gain support in the African continent. But beware. This kind of humanitarian charity will come with a bitter price tag. Without urgent action, more and more people in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond will slip into hunger. Mr. President, the biggest challenge in every conflict is protecting civilians. It is at the same time a collective, solemn commitment. Resolution 2417 represents a breakthrough moment, since, for the first time, the Security Council acknowledged the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity and the threat of famine. Using starvation as a weapon, as a tactic of warfare, is wrong and criminal. It is prohibited by international humanitarian law, and we must never tolerate any unlawful denial of humanitarian access and depriving civilians of what is indispensable to their survival. We must never tolerate impunity for violations of international humanitarian law, targeting civilian infrastructure and food-related services. Albania commends the efforts and actions of member states, the UN, its implementing partners, civil society, and the private sector in addressing immediate humanitarian needs, food security, and resilience for populations in need. But the best and the most effective way of preventing famine is to prevent conflict, to stop wars, to tackle the root causes of insecurity at early stages, and invest in peace and development in order to secure sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems in line with the objectives of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by saying that the world has enough food and no one needs to go hungry. Yet, if we really want to ensure food security, we should act to prevent and stop conflicts by choosing peace and development, by engaging into inclusive peace processes, leading to sustainable political solutions, by building resilience, by working together in favor of life with rights and dignity. This is done by saying no, strongly and resolutely, to wars and conflicts and their devastating consequences. This requires vision, leadership, political will, and decisive action. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Fino for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État. Permettez-moi d'abord de féliciter le Royaume-Uni pour sa présidence du Conseil en juillet. Et je souhaite à vous, Monsieur le Président, ainsi qu'à votre équipe, plein de succès pour la tenue des travaux de ce mois. Vous pouvez compter sur le soutien de la Suisse. Je vous remercie aussi pour l'organisation de ce débat qui tombe à point nommé, ainsi que les intervenantes et l'intervenant pour leurs contributions. Nous saluons également la présence des représentants de haut niveau. La guerre engendre la faim, et la faim engendre la guerre. La crise alimentaire mondiale est sans précédent et déstabilise des pays et des régions, comme l'a démontré aussi le débat ouvert sur la protection des civils en mai dernier sous présidence suisse. Le phénomène continue de s'aggraver en Somalie, au Soudan, notamment au Darfour, au Soudan du Sud, au Sahel, en Afghanistan, au Yémen, en Syrie et ailleurs dans le monde. Ainsi, nous regrettons la décision de la Russie de cesser la mise en œuvre de l'initiative de la mer Noire et condamnons les récentes attaques visant les ports ukrainiens qui risquent de détériorer la situation mondiale davantage. En adoptant la résolution 2417, ce Conseil s'est dit conscient de la nécessité de mettre fin au cercle vicieux du conflit armé et de l'insécurité alimentaire. Il s'est engagé à y prêter toute l'attention voulue afin de mieux prévenir la famine. Le rôle du Conseil dans la prévention des crises est également au cœur du nouvel agenda pour la paix. La Suisse appelle à la pleine mise en œuvre des mécanismes de prévention prévus dans la résolution 2417 et se félicite de la récente réunion sur la sécurité alimentaire en République démocratique du Congo, au Burkina Faso et en Haïti. Afin de mieux prévenir les crises alimentaires, y compris la famine, mon pays appelle à renforcer les trois domaines suivants. Premièrement, le respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme par toutes les parties est impératif afin de minimiser l'impact des conflits armés sur la situation alimentaire. L'accès des civils aux biens et services essentiels doit être préservé. Les objets indispensables à la survie des civils, à l'instar des denrées alimentaires, des installations d'eau et d'autres infrastructures nécessaires à la production et à l'approvisionnement alimentaire, ne peuvent faire l'objet d'attaques et doivent être protégés comme l'exige le droit international humanitaire. Nous appelons les parties concernées à garantir l'acheminement rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire aux personnes dans le besoin. Nous déplorons que les acteurs humanitaires tels que le CICR ne soient pas toujours en mesure de mener à bien leurs opérations, comme en ce moment à travers le corridor de la Chine dans les Caucases du Sud. Nous rappelons également l'importance de la mise en en œuvre
We
de
also
la
recall the
résolution
importance of implementing Council
2664 de ce
Resolution
Conseil
2664,
qui facilite les
which
opérations
facilitates
humanitaires dans
humanitarian
certains contextes
operations
les plus difficiles.
in some of the most difficult contexts.
Deuxièmement, dans de nombreux contextes
Second,
fragiles,
in
ce
many
sont souvent les
fragile
femmes et les
contexts,
filles
it is often
qui mangent en
women
dernier
and
et
girls
celles qui
who
mangent le
eat
moins.
last and eat least.
C'est encore plus vrai dans les situations
This
de
is even
conflit
truer in
où ces
situations
dernières
of
cherchent des
conflict,
solutions.
where women and girls
Comme l'a
also
souligné
seek
la
solutions,
représentante
as
spéciale du
pointed out by the
secrétaire
Special
général
Representative
chargée de
of
la
the
question
Secretary
des
General
violences
on
sexuelles commises
sexual
en période
violence
de
in
conflit.
conflict.
Nous ne devons pas
We
sous-estimer le
must
fait
not
que
underestimate
l'insécurité
the fact
alimentaire
that food
augmente le risque
insecurity
d'exposition à la
increases the
violence
risk
sexuelle.
of exposure
C'est
to
pourquoi
sexual
nous devons
violence.
veiller à l'intégrer
This
une
is why we
perspective
need
de
to
genre
ensure that
dans les
a
mesures
gender
visant à
perspective
améliorer la
is
sécurité
integrated into
alimentaire.
measures to improve food
Troisièmement,
security.
l'impunité,
Third,
notamment pour ceux
impunity,
qui affament
particularly for those
délibérément
who
des
deliberately
civils comme méthode
starve
de guerre,
civilians
doit
as a
être
method of
résolument
warfare,
combattue.
must be
Trop
resolutely
souvent, les
combated.
populations civiles sont
All too
délibérément
often, the civilian
délibérément
population
privées
is
de leurs
deliberately
moyens de
deprived of
subsistance,
its means of
ce qui
subsistance,
provoque d'immenses souffrances et
causing immense
déstabilise
suffering
encore davantage les
and further
zones de conflit.
destabilizing conflict
En
zones.
2019, le
In
statut de la Cour
2019,
pénale internationale
the
a été
statute of the
modifié
International
à
Criminal Court
l'initiative
was
de la Suisse
amended
afin
on
que ce
Switzerland's
crime puisse
initiative
également être
so that
poursuivi
this crime
dans les
can also be
situations de conflit
prosecuted in
interne.
situations of
Nous
internal
appelons tous
conflict.
les États partis à
We
ratifier
call on
cet
all
amendement.
states parties to ratify this
Monsieur le
amendment.
Président, la paix se
President,
bâtit mal à l'estomac vide.
You cannot build
L'agronome
peace on
américain
empty
et lauréat
stomachs,
du
as
prix
the
Nobel
American
Norman
agronomist
Borlaug
and
nous le
Nobel
rappelle.
Prize winner
Il est
Norman
d'autant plus
Borlaug
important
reminds
de
us.
s'attaquer
This makes it
aux
all
causes
the more
profondes
important
de
to tackle the
l'insécurité
root causes
alimentaire.
of food insecurity.
Les conflits armés et la
Armed
violence
conflict and
en
violence
sont le moteur principal.
are the
La
main
pression
drivers.
croissante exercée
The
par
growing
des crises
pressure
économiques
exerted by
et le
economic
changement
crises
climatique
and
ajoute
climate
aux
change
difficultés. Les
add to
solutions
the
politiques aux
difficulties.
conflits
Political
doivent faire partie de
solutions to
notre approche
conflict
globale
must be
visant à
part of our
éliminer la
global
faim,
approach to
à
eliminating
garantir à
hunger,
tous l'accès à une nourriture
ensuring
suffisante
access
et
to
adéquate
sufficient and
et à
adequate food
promouvoir
for
des
all,
systèmes alimentaires
and
résilients,
promoting resilient,
inclusifs et
inclusive and sustainable
Je vous
food
remercie.
systems. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Suisse. I now
Aye.
give the floor to the representative of
I thank
Brazil.
the representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers for their compelling presentations. As focal points for this issue at the Council, together with Switzerland, we thank the United States for providing this opportunity to advance our fight against conflict-induced food insecurity and malnutrition. We also congratulate the United States on the initiative and the Council on the adoption of the presidential statement on conflict-induced food insecurity. According to the 2023 State of Food Security and Nutrition Report, it is projected that almost 600 million people will still be facing hunger by 2030. In 2022 alone, 2.4 billion people lacked access to adequate, nutritious, safe, and sufficient food. The combination of impacts from the pandemic, climate shocks, high interest rates, high food and energy prices, and conflicts has put global food security and nutrition in dire straits, with armed conflict figuring as a prominent driver of hunger. Brazil believes that the best way to prevent hunger and malnutrition in the long term is to ensure that countries have the capacity to build resilient agri-food systems and markets. We must take into account structural causes of hunger, including inequalities between and within countries, barriers to food trade, unilateral sanctions, and weak or absent social protection and poverty alleviation policies. To ensure stability and continuity in food production, international attention must be given to supporting sustainable agricultural practices, developing disaster-resilient infrastructures, and promoting diversified agri-food systems. Ensuring the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets is essential to sustain food security in conflict situations, as recognized in Resolution 2417/2018. Facilitating the transfer and access to efficient and productive technologies is central to ensuring diversified, resilient, and sustainable food systems. In line with the Secretary General Initiative on Early Warnings for All, the international community must support dedicated capacity building in developing countries to allow us to be better prepared for shocks on the availability and accessibility of food. To reach this goal, cash transfer programs should be prioritized to sustain both local supply and demand. Additionally, tools such as the IMF Food Shock Window or the Food Import Financing Facility proposed by FAO should be further explored to bridge financing needs while avoiding market distortions and disruptions. The reform of multilateral agricultural trade rules is also essential to prevent global food insecurity. Many countries affected by conflicts had their agricultural development restricted by trade and price-distorting subsidies that negatively affect their production capacities. Mr. President, an important element of this open debate refers to the collaboration between the Security Council, the UN system, and other actors to catalyze global efforts, ensure delivery of humanitarian assistance, and minimize the effects of conflict-induced food insecurity. Member states must fully incorporate in their work the tools already in place in the UN system to fight conflict-induced hunger. Bodies such as OCHA, the World Food Programme, and FAO diligently inform on risks of acute food insecurity in countries with conflict situations through different reports, including the White Notes mandated by Resolution 2417/2018, to which the Council must dedicate its full attention. An efficient response to conflict-induced famine must encompass the appropriate use of this information and timely and decisive action in response to it. International humanitarian law strictly prohibits starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and grants special protection to objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including food crops, livestock, and other essential resources necessary for food production. However, even when parties to a conflict comply with international humanitarian law, food systems can be disrupted by the secondary impacts of conflict. Humanitarian exemptions essential to the survival of the civilian population also need to be systematically included in sanctioned regimes and counterterrorism measures. Otherwise, humanitarian actors have to overcome complex legal, financial, and logistical roadblocks to ensure that those in need get appropriate assistance. Humanitarian needs play a central role, but they can be better supported if coupled with development-oriented measures such as dedicated agricultural, technical, and subsistence support. International cooperation, generous, sustained, result-oriented international cooperation in its many forms is essential to achieve this goal. Brazil has been active in promoting such cooperation with fellow developing countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, and we pledge to do more. Each situation of conflict presents different challenges for agri-food systems and the affected populations. For instance, as recently reported by FAO, in many cases, women are still more vulnerable to food and nutrition insecurity as they continue to face additional risks, barriers, and disadvantages due to their gender. Mr. President, our response to conflict-induced food insecurity must involve the three pillars of the United Nations. Humanitarian needs must be met, and its delivery allowed in an unimpeded and impartial manner. The Council must use its political capacity to push for solutions to conflicts that can alleviate challenges related to food accessibility. We will remain fully engaged in all these fronts and continue to be a firm advocate of the right of every person to sufficient, nutritious, and adequate food. I reaffirm the highest priority given by the Brazilian government to eliminate hunger in all situations and to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. The only assured way to end conflict-induced hunger is peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Je
President.
félicite les États-Unis d'Amérique
I
pour la présidence du
congratulate the
Conseil
United
et
States of
pour
America
l'initiative
for
de
assuming
cet
the
important
presidency of the
débat qui
Council,
met
for
en
taking
relief
this initiative
le lien entre
to hold
l'insécurité
this
alimentaire
important debate
et les
that
conflits
highlights the
armés.
link between food insecurity
Je
and
remercie la
conflict.
coordinatrice des Nations Unies
I'd like
pour
to
la
thank the
prévention
UN
et la riposte à la
coordinator
famine,
for prevention
Madame
and
Rina
response to
Guelani,
famine, Madame
pour sa
Rina
riche contribution.
Guelani, for her valuable
J'ai
contribution.
suivi avec attention
And I
les
listened very
interventions
carefully
poignantes de
to
Madame Navin Salem
a
et
briefing
de
by
Monsieur David
Madame
Miliband.
Navin Salem and Mr. David
Monsieur,
Miliband.
Madame le Président, notre
President,
débat se tient une semaine
Our
après
debate
le
is
sommet
being held
des
one
Nations
week
Unies
after
sur les
the
systèmes
United Nations
alimentaires
Summit on
qui a
food
interpellé la
systems.
conscience universelle sur les proportions alarmantes de la famine dans le monde et martelé l'exigence ainsi que l'urgence d'y faire face. Notre réunion se tient surtout à un moment où la sécurité internationale suscite plus de questions que de réponses. En adoptant les conventions de Genève et leurs protocoles additionnels, les nations du monde ont clairement et unanimement souscrit dans leur contrat social que la guerre a des règles et que la belligérance n'est absolument pas une situation de non-droit dans laquelle toutes les cruautés et atrocités sont permises. Cet encadrement de la guerre nous connecte à notre humanité, même dans les moments les plus troubles. En aucun moment, nous ne pouvons pas, nous ne devons pas perdre de vue que la famine est une honte et une atteinte grave à la dignité humaine. Elle est encore plus insoutenable lorsqu'elle est planifiée ou entretenue, en sachant que les ressources ne manquent pas, comme l'a si bien souligné tout à l'heure Mme Guélémy. Malheureusement, dans plusieurs champs de bataille et foyers de tension dans le monde, la famine est utilisée comme arme de guerre. Au gré des calculs absurdes, l'accès à la nourriture se retrouve souvent entravé. Les pénuries qui en résultent génèrent très souvent la famine et les maladies inhérentes à la malnutrition et contribuent à détricoter le tissu social de fragments entiers de l'humanité. Les civils, en particulier, les femmes et les enfants, sont les plus exposés aux effets qui en découlent. Lorsqu'elle n'est pas utilisée comme arme de guerre, la famine est très souvent source de conflits et d'instabilité dans les États fragiles. En tant qu'Africains, nous sommes fondés pour en parler. Sur le continent africain, plus de 80% des personnes confrontées à l'insécurité alimentaire vivent dans des zones touchées par des conflits. Le récent rapport des Nations Unies sur la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition dans le monde met clairement en évidence l'incitation que la famine exerce sur les conflits armés, qu'elle catalyse au même titre que d'autres menaces à la paix et à la sécurité internationale, notamment les changements climatiques. Parallèlement, les conflits armés déclenchent et exacerbent les crises humanitaires, la pauvreté et la famine. Ces facteurs interagissent et se renforcent mutuellement, créant un cercle vicieux de détresse intenable. Madame la Présidente, la résolution 2417, adoptée par ce Conseil le 24 mai 2018, reconnaît l'étroitesse du lien entre les conflits armés et l'insécurité alimentaire. La persistance de la faim non seulement questionne notre humanité, mais également réduit en fiction les efforts de la communauté internationale pour mettre fin aux conflits armés. Dans plusieurs régions du monde, notamment au Sahel, dans la région des Grands Lacs et dans la Corne de l'Afrique, les groupes armés et groupes terroristes détruisent délibérément les magasins d'alimentation, brûlent les champs, empêchent les paysans de cultiver, détruisent les infrastructures de production, les systèmes de transport et de distribution des denrées alimentaires. Dans ces régions où l'instabilité devient chronique, les enfants squelettiques meurent de faim à la merci des oiseaux de proie. Cette situation est moralement insoutenable. Nous devons y répondre en tant que Conseil de sécurité, sur qui les peuples du monde ont placé le destin de leur sécurité et de leur dignité. Notre réponse doit aller au-delà des déclarations cosmétiques et s'inscrire à la dimension du défi. Notre dynamique de mobilisation doit être globale pour faire face aux effets des conflits armés sur la sécurité alimentaire dans le monde et en définitive prévenir l'émergence de nouveaux foyers de famine. En premier lieu, nous devons être plus engagés
we
pour
must
financer
make a stronger
l'adaptation au changement
commitment
climatique
to
et
finance
investir
adaptation to climate
davantage
change and
dans
invest
l'agriculture
more
durable
in
et la
sustainable
sécurité alimentaire à long
agriculture
terme.
and long-term food
Cela
security.
implique de soutenir les petits agriculteurs,
This involves
d'améliorer les
supporting
infrastructures
small-scale
agricoles et
farmers,
de promouvoir des pratiques
improving
agricoles
agricultural
respectueuses de l'environnement.
infrastructure and promoting
L'appel
agricultural
à l'action
practices
du
that are
secrétaire
respectful
général
of
des
the
Nations Unies,
environment.
Antonio Guterres,
The call to action
pour
of the Secretary
accélérer la
General of the
transformation
United
des
Nations
systèmes
to
alimentaires
accelerate transformation of
mérite
food
d'être
systems
salué et de trouver
deserves to
une
be
réponse
welcomed.
favorable
It
auprès de tous.
also should find a favorable
En second lieu,
response from all of
nous
us.
devons renforcer
Secondly,
les
we
mécanismes
must
de
strengthen
réponse
the
d'urgence pour
mechanisms
faire
for
face
emergency
aux
response
crises
to
alimentaires
dealing
aiguës,
with
en
acute
renforçant
food
les systèmes d'alerte
crises. We should
précoce,
do so by
la
strengthening
fourniture d'une aide
early warning
alimentaire
systems,
d'urgence
by
et la
providing
coordination des
emergency
efforts
food
entre
aid
les
and
agences humanitaires
coordinating
et
efforts
les États
across
membres.
humanitarian agencies and
Troisièmement,
member states.
nous devons veiller à la sanctuarisation
Thirdly,
des
we
stocks de
must
sécurité des
ensure
denrées alimentaires,
that
notamment en
emergency
consolidant
food
les
reserves
mécanismes
are
existants de
ring-fenced,
prévention,
notably by
de
consolidating
résolution
the
et de
existing
consolidation
mechanisms for
post-conflit
prevention,
et les
resolution and
intégrer de manière
post-conflict
absolue
consolidation and
dans la
integrate
gestion
them
des crises
fully
alimentaires
in the
conformément aux
management of
dispositions
food
des
crisis
résolutions 2217
in
sur la faim et la
compliance with the
sécurité,
provisions of
la
Resolution
résolution
2217 on hunger and
2573 sur la
security, Resolution
protection des infrastructures civiles
2573 on
essentielles
the
en temps de
protection
conflit,
of
ou
essential
encore la
civilian
résolution
infrastructure in times of conflict,
2417 qui engage
and
les parties
also
au
Resolution
conflit à ne pas
2417
entraver le bon fonctionnement
that
des systèmes
requires
alimentaires
parties to a
et
conflict
des marchés en
not
situation de
to
conflit,
obstruct
d'une part,
the
et d'autre
proper
part,
functioning of food systems
offrir
and
une
markets
assistance
in
technique
conflict
aux
situations
pays
on the one
fragiles,
hand, and by the
aussi
same
bien dans
time
le
offering
domaine du
technical
stockage des réserves
assistance
que dans
to
les technologies
fragile countries,
adéquates.
both in the area of
Madame la Présidente,
reserve storage and
il est
adequate
manifeste
technologies.
que l'insécurité
President, it is
alimentaire
clear
est une
that
menace
food
pour la
insecurity
paix et
is
la
a
sécurité
threat
mondiale
to international peace
et
and security.
exacerbe plutôt
It
les
also
crises humanitaires.
exacerbates humanitarian
L'insécurité
crises.
alimentaire est le reflet de la crise de solidarité qui nous interpelle.
Food
En tant que
insecurity
représentants des
is a
peuples du monde,
reflection of the crisis of
en tant que maillons de
solidarity that
l'humanité,
is challenging us as
nous devons
representatives
y
of the people
répondre
of the world
plus
and as
efficacement
human
et de
beings.
façon
We
concertée,
must find
sans plus
a
attendre.
more effective
Plus
way
que
of
jamais,
responding to this and do so
il est
in a
temps
more concerted
de
fashion
s'attaquer
without
aux
delay.
causes profondes des conflits.
Now more than ever, it is
même,
time that
il
we
est
tackle the
fondamental
underlying causes
de
of
promouvoir
conflict.
le
It is
dialogue,
also
la
fundamental
médiation
that we
et la
promote
diplomatie
dialogue,
pour
mediation
résoudre
and
les
diplomacy
différends et les
to
tensions qui
resolve
conduisent aux conflits armés.
disputes and tensions
La
that can lead
prévention
to
des
armed
conflits
conflict.
est un
Prevention
facteur clé
of conflict
pour
is a
garantir la
key
sécurité
factor to
alimentaire
guaranteeing
et
food
endiguer
security
l'indignité
and halting
que constitue
the
la famine.
indignity
Je vous
that
remercie.
famine represents. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Madam President, I acknowledge the United States leadership on the important issue of global food insecurity, which thrice in your successive presidencies has found expression in the Council's work. I assure you of Ghana's support and cooperation during your presidency this month, and congratulate Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the United Kingdom delegation for effectively leading the Council during the month of July. We also thank Ms. Rina Gelani, Mr. David Miliband, and Ms. Navin Salem for their briefing, which underscored the magnitude of famine globally and the severity of conflict-induced food insecurity, including for vulnerable countries and populations in Africa. Madam President, the stark reality of food insecurity across the world is alarming. 828 million people are reported to be suffering from hunger, and some 50 million people are on the brink of starvation. These numbers reflect the lives of real people and tell a harrowing story of our collective failure to address this most basic of human needs. 5 years since the adoption of Resolution 2417, conflict has remained a primary driver of acute food insecurity. However, food insecurity is not only a consequence of violent conflict. Combined with other factors, it can be a driver of violent conflict and a contributory factor for their emergence and length. In several places across the world, rising food and fuel prices have led to widespread unrest and instability. And on the African continent, where the fragilities are deep, sharp rises in food prices have often correlated with political dissatisfaction, protests, and agitations that have affected political stability. Today, as a result of the impact of the war in Ukraine, we see the disruptive influence of food insecurity in every country, and on everyone. We are bound in our experience by the strong headwinds that the aggression against Ukraine has created in our socioeconomic circumstances. While we therefore welcome the recent announcement by the Russian Federation at the second Russia-Africa Summit to provide grain shipments to 6 African countries at no cost, we are concerned and deeply disappointed that the Black Sea Grain Initiative has not been renewed. A renewal of the initiative, accompanied by a resolution of challenges with the export of Russian ammonia, as well as agricultural products and fertilizers to global markets, represents a more durable way to prevent speculative spikes in global food prices and strengthen global food security while mitigating their knock-on effects. We therefore call on all parties to work constructively to ensure the renewal of the initiative. Madam President, as we reflect over the implementation of Resolution 2417 and the important contribution it has made in the past 5 years, Ghana believes that we must continue to be focused on the important task of breaking the destructive link between armed conflict and hunger by ensuring that the associated positive effects of food systems can promote peace and the supply of safe and nutritious food to civilians. In this regard, we continue to urge the international community to implement a series of emergency measures and simultaneously pursue long-term investments to break the vicious cycle of hunger and conflict. In respect of the immediate measures, Ghana urges for urgency and scaling of our actions to respond to the acute food insecurity and nutrition needs of the millions of vulnerable people in conflict situations around the world, especially in Africa, which is the hardest hit. We call on the international community and donor agencies to respond to the underfunded humanitarian response plans for African countries and to prioritize the implementation of the humanitarian response plans for countries in West Africa and the Sahel by helping to meet the $3.5 billion United States target required to tackle the increasing humanitarian needs. We also urge the strengthening of pre-positioned assets at global and regional humanitarian hubs to help interconnect food stocks quickly and effectively with the growing humanitarian needs. We encourage the deployment of strong efforts to reverse the rapid and dramatic deterioration in food security observed in conflict-affected settings and urge a unified call by the international community in demanding that parties to conflict comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Madam President, we emphasize the need for long-term investments, especially in countries where there is an acute alignment between food insecurity and conflict. In relation to this, I will make 3 brief additional points. First, our actions must continue to emphasize the preservation of the peace, the prevention of conflicts, and the early deployment of pacific means for the resolution of disputes before they lead to violence between states or within a state. Second, our actions must focus on building resilience in economies and food systems. Besides acknowledging the effects that the climate change has on food insecurity and conflicts, our common efforts should also support efforts for adaptation measures in developing countries and agricultural initiatives such as the African Common Position for Sustainable Food Systems, the further implementation of the African Union's Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program and its results framework, regional food security facilities such as ECOWAS's Food Security Reserve, and the effective implementation of the African Development Bank facility to boost food security, nutrition, and resilience on the African continent. Thirdly, we need to bridge the gap between needs and supplies, especially for regions that may be experiencing drought conditions and where the impact of climate change-induced situations could aggravate conflicts. In this regard, we urge support for the accelerated implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area to help avert future food supply chain disruptions on the African continent. Madam President, in concluding, Ghana welcomes the adoption of today's presidential statement and would like to underscore the need to act with urgency, at scale, and in concert to respond to the urgent food security and nutrition needs of the millions of vulnerable people around the world, whose situations have been worsened by conflict. We must also be resolved to provide immediate humanitarian assistance, build resilience of the most vulnerable, and strengthen sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And allow me to thank you for organizing today's important debate, and I wish you and your team every success in your presidency of the Council. Let me also thank the United Kingdom for presiding over the Council over the month of July. I also thank today's briefers for their powerful and compelling testimony, analysis, and direct calls to actions. Malta welcomes the adoption of this morning's PRST for today's meeting. Today, the world is experiencing an acute, alarming rise in food insecurity. This threatens not only the lives of millions, but the societal fabric in a myriad of countries across the globe, representing a grave threat to international peace and security. Arresting this crisis will require a response commensurate to the catastrophe itself, in which over 258 million people globally will require urgent and sustained aid. From Afghanistan to Haiti and Sudan, populations are already in crisis levels of hunger, with projections from leading famine, food and agriculture and humanitarian organizations stating that peak global hunger is projected for this December. As we know, this crisis is not gender neutral. Food insecurity and gender inequality are interlinked, as women and girls often have less access and control over land, smallholder agricultural market support, and humanitarian assistance. The conflict in Sudan has severely disrupted the production of crops throughout the country, with estimates that 40% of the population, or 19 million people, are already facing alarming levels of hunger. As the conflict has disrupted farming, it has also disrupted sowing and harvesting. With limited access to seeds and fertilizers, the yield of the next season is in major doubt. Unless urgently addressed, this will compound hunger and guarantee human-induced famine in the months ahead. This situation would have catastrophic consequences for Sudan and the region, where agriculture is a principal source of income and livelihood for the majority of the population. President, just as conflict is a driver of hunger, violence can drive humanitarian operations out of areas of extreme danger. Violence often constrains access for medical and humanitarian organizations. Therefore, leading organizations to work where they can rather than where they are needed most. Today, we see instances of this in Haiti, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burkina Faso. In civil conflict, humanitarian access can be denied by way of arbitrary and bureaucratic measures. This Council should never accept such attempts to instrumentalize international law. Neither should we accept attempts at shielding such actions from this Council's scrutiny. We urge the UN to continue detailing such access impediments in their reports to this Council and in the White Notes mandated by Security Council Resolution 2417. While coordinating with the host state on the development of such documents, the UN must always assert its operational independence. Only by doing so can we collectively act in a timely manner. Furthermore, this Council must take seriously its obligations to ensure accountability for those who have ordered, participated in the destruction, or prevented the functionality of civilian infrastructure critical for the production of food. Impunity only begets further violations. From generals to local commanders, consequences must follow from violations. To this end, we also call on the UN to work closer with warring parties, especially states, to ensure that adequate deconfliction of such infrastructure in times of armed conflict is conducted. President, Malta regrets the Russian Federation's termination of its involvement in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This initiative had ensured the safe passage of over 32 million metric tons of food commodities from Ukrainian ports, relieving hunger in some of the hardest hit corners of the world. We urge the Russian Federation to re-engage with the good offices of the Secretary General and reconsider the dramatic impacts this action will have. In conclusion, without urgent, coordinated humanitarian and emergency agricultural intervention, our inaction could condemn millions to starvation. From painful past experiences, we have learned that efforts to avert famine are effective when the international community works together in a goal-oriented manner. Greater resourcing for climate resilience, agricultural innovation, anticipatory action programs, and crucially early agricultural interventions is now paramount to stave off the worst of the coming global hunger crisis. Alleviating acute hunger is the first step on the road to peace building. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique congratulates Your Excellency and the U.S. government for assuming the presidency of the Security Council. We pledge to cooperate fully with you and the United States team in the Security Council. We highly commend the United States for placing the topic famine and conflict-induced global food insecurity on the agenda of the Council for 3 consecutive years. In that connection, we welcome the presidential statement just adopted this morning. We wish to pay tribute to Her Excellency Ambassador Barbara Woodward of UK and the UK team as a whole for their excellent presidency of the Security Council in the month of July. We thank the distinguished briefers for their important insights on this important topic. Madam President, end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote agriculture is one of the stated goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. One of the major obstacles of achieving this noble goal is the growing incidence in the world of armed conflicts, terrorism, and other related factors. They affect food security, where the fightings take place and beyond. The conflicts disrupt and destroy food systems, decrease farming populations, destroy infrastructure, reduce resilience, and increase vulnerability. According to the Global Report on Food Crisis, armed conflicts and other threats to security pushed 139 million people into acute food insecurity in 2021. This is an increase of almost 40 million people compared to the year before. In 2022, the situation has worsened further as the impacts of the armed conflicts were felt across the globe. The 2023 report suggests that conflict pushed over 117 million people into acute food insecurity in the first half of the year alone, in addition to other negative factors such as economic shocks and extreme weather conditions. We come from Africa, a region where our heads of state and government have committed themselves to a collective policy of silencing the guns and promoting development for peace and prosperity of our nations. We are therefore aware of this vicious link between insecurity and armed conflicts. Many countries in Africa and Asia are the focus of the attention of famine reporters. These are countries where the specter of food insecurity could be dramatic if an urgent and consistent humanitarian action is not taken. We believe cooperation and understanding between states or warring parties to extend humanitarian aid and safeguard the human dignity would immensely contribute to minimizing the suffering of those populations who live the tragedy of war on a daily basis. Mozambique stands in solidarity with all populations that, in the aftermath of various conflicts, including those motivated by transnational terrorists, are forced to leave their production areas, thereby increasing the pressure for humanitarian aid. We defend the creation of conditions for access to humanitarian aid without hindrance, in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, countering prevailing gloomy situation requires, among other things, an in-depth knowledge of the evolving threats and challenges we are confronted with. It also requires the ability to reach the affected segments of population, provide them with individualized and well-timed support in response to their needs, and strengthen their positive coping mechanisms. This is best done through partnership and collaboration that reinforce existing support structures and leverage the comparative advantages of the many organizations and entities present in any humanitarian crisis, taking into account the local, national, and regional realities. To achieve this end, Mozambique encourages the adoption of a humanitarian, integrated, and inclusive approach based on an intersectoral coordination at all levels between local, national, regional, and international partners. Public and private sector should be included in order to ensure sustainable food and nutritional security for needy populations with a view to creating sustainable food systems. Madam President, based on our own experience in Mozambique, we are of the view that food security at national or international level comes with peace and a normalization of people's lives. It comes with the will and the strength to negotiate and settle peacefully the disputes everywhere they arise. In the meanwhile, to mitigate dire humanitarian situations, some actions must be taken, individually or collectively, by states, donors, and organizations that include: 1, strengthening the productive capacity of concerned countries by facilitating access to production technologies, including adequate funding for agriculture, livestock, and fisheries sectors in order to prevent conflicts. 2, lifting all constraints, barriers, and protection measures to the distribution chain of fertilizers and inputs. 3, encouraging strict compliance with obligations under international humanitarian law, reminding all parties to conflicts that indispensable objects for the survival of civilians are to be respected and safeguarded. 4, providing technical assistance and inclusion of groups most vulnerable to conflict in food systems value chains. These include women, youth, and individuals with disabilities. Madam President, Mozambique calls on the Security Council to do all in its power towards achieving a cessation of hostilities in all conflicts that continue to claim human lives in the world. It is our duty under the Charter to free innocent civilians from the scourge of war and from perpetual situation of hunger and famine. We urge the United Nations member states to channel all means and resources to the attainment of peace, security, and stability. These are, in our view, the solid foundations for promoting and building global food security worldwide. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank Ms. Golani, Mr. Miliband, and Ms. Salam for their briefings. Food issue concerns people's livelihoods and security. It is complex and sensitive. It has a wide linkage to production and supply chains and is one of the long-term and recurrent global challenges. The Security Council is highly concerned about this issue and has taken positive actions from different perspectives, including the adoption of Resolution 2417, which sets clear requirements for protecting civilians and agricultural facilities and increasing humanitarian inputs in armed conflicts. The international community should work together to promote the implementation and effectiveness of relevant Council resolutions, adhere to political settlement of disputes, and break the vicious cycle of conflict and famine. At present, the global food security situation is getting worse. The data shown in UN reports and the situation introduced by the briefers are shocking and worrying. China supports UN agencies in utilizing their professional advantages and coordinating roles by mobilizing the international community, especially developed countries, to increase humanitarian assistance and to fill the funding gap in global humanitarian response so as to alleviate the urgent needs of people in relevant countries. While addressing urgent issues, in order to thoroughly solve the food crisis, it is necessary to focus on the root causes and conduct a systematic review. The biggest victims of the food crisis are all developing countries without exception. Food insecurity is essentially the results of insufficient and unbalanced development on a global scale, and is a concrete manifestation of the development gap between the North and the South. It is closely related to the long-standing unjust and unreasonable food production and trade system and international governance system. The international community should seize the opportunity of the SDG summit in September and the summit for the future next year to address both the symptoms and root causes, to improve rules and regulations and take comprehensive measures to achieve the goal of zero hunger in 2030 as scheduled. I would like to make the following points. First, firmly establish the concept of common security. The causes of food crisis are complex and is intertwined with other traditional and non-traditional security issues. Without the common security of the international community, it is difficult to have sustainable food security. We should uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept, stay committed to settling disputes in peaceful manners and advocate dialogue, and respond to various challenges such as food insecurity with a spirit of unity and win-win mindset. We must firmly oppose unilateral sanctions and actions that affect international food security and global cooperation, such as decoupling and disrupting supply chain, disrupting market order, or suppressing enterprises from other countries. China urges relevant countries to immediately stop such practice that lack legal foundations and is also in contrary to fairness and justice. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the MOU on Russia's grain and fertilizer exports have a positive impact on maintaining global food security. At present, the window of opportunity for restoring the package agreement still exists. China hopes that all relevant parties will intensify dialogue and consultation, meet each other halfway, strive to balance and solve the legitimate concerns of all parties, and restore the exports of food and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine as soon as possible. China supports the Secretary General and relevant parties in continuing efforts to this end. Second, bridge the development gap between North and South with a faster pace. Sustainable development is the most fundamental guarantee for achieving common food security. The international community should address the issue of food insecurity in the context of sustainable development and take advantage of the stock-taking moments of 2023, such as the SDG Summit and the UN Food System Summit. Listen carefully to the voice of developing countries, strengthen North-South dialogue and coordination, gather more development resources, and build greater development synergies. We should vigorously assist developing countries in need to solve problems in areas such as agriculture, rural areas, and farmers, to enhance resilience to climate change and natural disasters, and increase food production and self-sufficiency. Developed countries should cancel unreasonable agricultural subsidies and adopt reasonable monetary policies, reduce the impact of imported inflation, exchange rates and fluctuations, and other factors on food security in developing countries. At the same time, it is necessary to earnestly fulfill their ODA commitments, refrain from technology lockdowns and the practice of small yards and high fence. Rather, we should accelerate the technology transfer, application, and sharing of knowledge in areas such as biology, digital, and space to create a better condition for developing countries to strengthen capacity building and achieve sustainable development. Third, improve the global food and agriculture governance system. The international grain market has long faced problems such as monopoly of pricing power by major grain merchants, structural imbalance in the production and supply chain, and high monetization of agriculture products. Certain countries has indiscriminately implemented unilateral coercive measures, causing serious difficulties in agriculture and economic development of the targeted countries. The international community should attach great importance to these persistent problems that undermine global food security and promote their solutions, and take an overall consideration in the preparation process of the SDG Summit and the Future Summit, improve global food and agriculture governance from an institutional and rules-making levels, focusing on increasing the representation, voice, and decision-making power of developing countries. Efforts should be made to remove the restrictions of unilateral sanctions on food production and exports, combat speculative capitals and price monopoly, to build a safe, stable, efficient, open, inclusive, and mutually beneficial supply chain system, as well as a more fair and reasonable international food trade order. Madam President, actions speak louder than words. China has made contributions to maintaining global food security with proactive actions. China has proposed global development initiatives and international food security cooperation initiatives, advocating for deepening practical food cooperation. We have been assisting developing countries in the form of funding technology and market to improve their food production, storage, and loss reduction capabilities. China has carried out agriculture cooperation with more than 140 countries and regions, promoted more than 1,000 agriculture technologies to developing countries, trained more than 14,000 professionals in hybrid rice technology for more than 80 developing countries, launched and we have also provided emergency food aid to countries in need. We stand ready to work with other countries to make greater contributions to global food security with deepened exchanges and cooperation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je tiens à vous féliciter et à remercier les États-Unis pour l'organisation de ce débat ouvert sur un sujet aussi important dans le prolongement de la réunion qui avait été organisée par la présidence britannique le 17 juillet dernier, à laquelle la ministre de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères avait participé. Et je remercie également chacune et chacun des intervenants pour leurs exposés. L'année 2022 a été une année noire pour la sécurité alimentaire et après le retrait russe de l'accord en mer Noire, nous pouvons nourrir les pires craintes pour les prochains mois. Cette crise aiguë touche le monde entier, mais elle frappe très sévèrement les pays les plus vulnérables et les plus pauvres. Et je voudrais commencer par ce point. La guerre d'agression de la Russie contre l'Ukraine continue d'aggraver une situation déjà extrêmement préoccupante, qui est causée à la fois par la multiplication des conflits armés, par les impacts du changement climatique, par l'érosion de la biodiversité et la pandémie de Covid-19. La Russie est directement responsable de l'aggravation de cette crise multifactorielle. Sourde aux efforts du secrétaire général des Nations Unies et de la Turquie, elle a mis fin de manière unilatérale, brutale, à l'initiative céréalière de la mer Noire qui permettait d'acheminer des céréales vers 45 pays et vers les populations vulnérables, y compris via une aide humanitaire du Programme alimentaire mondial. Elle permettait de stabiliser les cours mondiaux et d'éviter des pénuries. En privant les céréales ukrainiennes d'un accès aux marchés mondiaux, en bloquant la navigation en mer Noire, la Russie menace directement la sécurité alimentaire mondiale et l'approvisionnement des pays les plus touchés. Elle cherche ainsi à détruire les capacités de production, d'exportation ukrainienne, y compris en bombardant les infrastructures portuaires et les terminaux céréaliers, en violation complète du droit international. Son objectif est d'asphyxier le système agricole ukrainien, non seulement pour réduire les revenus de l'Ukraine, mais également pour s'arroger une position dominante sur les marchés et servir ses propres intérêts économiques, ceux de ses entreprises agricoles. Et la hausse du prix des céréales qu'elle entend provoquer changes that it
se
intends to
ferait à
cause
son profit,
would be to its
mais au
benefit,
détriment de l'ensemble
but
des
to the
autres pays.
detriment of all the other countries.
Donc après avoir exercé un chantage
And so, after
inacceptable
exercising
au renouvellement
unacceptable
de l'accord en
blackmail
mer
for the
Noire,
renewal of
elle
the
ajoute
Black
au
Sea
cynisme
Agreement, Russia now
l'irresponsabilité
adds
dans son
irresponsibility to
instrumentalisation de
cynicism
la
in its
crise alimentaire
instrumentalization
mondiale.
of the
La
world
Russie
food
doit
crisis.
cesser de
Russia
faire de
must
la faim une arme de
immediately
guerre.
stop using hunger as a weapon of war.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
la réponse à l'insécurité alimentaire et à la
response
malnutrition est la
to food
responsabilité de
insecurity
tous.
and malnutrition is
La
everyone's
France est pleinement engagée
responsibility.
dans ce combat. Elle a
France
pris
is fully committed
immédiatement
to this effort
l'initiative pour
and immediately
contribuer
took
à la
the initiative
réponse
to
à la crise alimentaire
respond
mondiale
to
en lançant
the
plusieurs
global food
initiatives,
crisis by launching a
notamment
number of
FARM
initiatives
et
such
le
as
sauvetage des
FARM
récoltes.
and
Nous avons
Harvest
ainsi mobilisé
Rescue.
cette année plus de
We
900 millions
have
d'euros
thus
pour l'aide
mobilized more than
d'urgence
900
alimentaire,
million
la résilience
euros for
agricole, le
emergency
développement
food aid,
des systèmes agricoles
agricultural
des pays les plus
resilience, and the
vulnérables,
development
dont
of
160 millions
agricultural
d'euros
systems
bénéficient
in
du
the
programme
most vulnerable
alimentaire mondial,
countries.
soit un doublement par rapport
Including
à l'année
160 million euros for
2021.
the World
Je vous
Food
rappelle que
Program.
dans le
This is
même temps,
double
la
the
Russie a
amount
divisé
compared to
par deux sa
2021. I
contribution
recall
au
that in the
programme
same
alimentaire
period,
mondial en
Russia
2022,
has cut its
qu'elle prive de
contribution
surcroît du
to
blé
the
ukrainien.
WFP by half,
Avec
while it
nos
also
partenaires
deprives it of
européens,
Ukrainian wheat.
nous appuyons les corridors de
With our
solidarité qui ont été mis
European
en place par
partners,
l'Union
we support the
européenne.
solidarity
Ils ont
corridors put
permis
in place by
d'acheminer
the
41
EU, which have
millions
made
de
it
tonnes de
possible
produits
to
céréaliers
transport
hors
41
d'Ukraine
million
depuis le mois de
tons
mars
of grain
2022.
products out of Ukraine
Ils sont
since
à ce
March
jour la seule voie
22.
d'acheminement de
They are
céréales
currently the
ukrainiennes
only
et
transport
nous
route for
entendons les
Ukrainian grain,
renforcer.
and we intend to
La France
strengthen them.
continuera d'être à l'initiative dans les
will
prochains
continue
mois
to
et elle
take the
accueillera
lead
la
in the
première
coming months
réunion
and will
mondiale de la
host
coalition pour
the first
l'alimentation
global meeting
scolaire
of the School
à
Meals
Paris au mois
Coalition in
d'octobre prochain.
Paris
Cette
in October of this
réunion doit
year.
permettre, cette initiative,
This
cette
initiative,
coalition se donne
this
pour objectif de
coalition
permettre
sets the
à chaque
goal
enfant
of
de bénéficier d'au moins un
enabling
repas sain
each
et
child
nutritif par
to
jour,
benefit from at least
ce
one
qui
and
représente
healthy,
à la fois
nutritious
un
meal
filet de
daily.
protection sociale, mais également un
This is
levier
something
pour
that
favoriser la
represents a
fréquentation
social safety
scolaire.
net, but
Elle
also a
accueillera
lever to
également le
promote
prochain
school
sommet
attendance.
nutrition pour la croissance.
France will also host the next Nutrition
Madame la
for Growth
Présidente, alors que
Summit.
l'insécurité alimentaire
Madam President, as food
atteint des niveaux
insecurity
inédits,
reaches
le respect
unprecedented
du droit
levels,
international
respect for
humanitaire est
international
un
humanitarian
impératif
law
pour
is
permettre
imperative
l'acheminement de l'aide
to allow the
aux
delivery
populations
of aid
des
to
populations
populations
dans
in
le
need.
besoin. La France rappelle que le fait d'affamer délibérément
France
des
recalls
civils
that
est
deliberately
constitutif de
starving
crime de guerre.
civilians constitutes a
Ce
war
crime ne
crime.
doit pas
This
rester
crime
impuni.
must not go
L'aide
unpunished.
humanitaire doit pouvoir être
Humanitarian
acheminée de manière
assistance
sûre,
must be able to be delivered
rapide, sans
safely,
entrave à l'ensemble des
quickly,
personnes
and
dans le
without
besoin.
hindrance to all
Et
those
comme
in
l'ensemble
need.
des briefeurs nous l'ont
And
rappelé,
as the
l'accès de
briefers
l'aide est
recalled,
clé et
access to
critique
aid is
pour
key,
l'ensemble des pays les
critical
plus à risque de
for
famine.
countries that are
Mais la France
at the
voudrait
highest
également
risk of
appeler
famine.
aujourd'hui à ce que les
France
entraves à
also
l'acheminement de l'aide
calls today
humanitaire
for
et
the lifting of
alimentaire
obstacles to the
pour la
delivery of
population du
humanitarian
Haut-Karabakh à travers le
assistance for
corridor
the
de
population
Latchin
of
soient levées,
Nagorno-Karabakh through
ainsi que les
the
entraves à la
Latchin
circulation,
corridor, as well as
conformément à
obstacles
l'ordonnance
to
de la
movement
CIJ du 22
in
février dernier.
accordance with the order of the ICJ
À l'heure où
of this
l'espace
February.
humanitaire se
At a
réduit, la
time
France réitère son plein
when the
et entier
humanitarian
soutien à
space is
l'ensemble
shrinking,
des
France
acteurs
reiterates its
de l'action
full and
humanitaire
complete
dans
support
l'exercice
for
de leur difficile
humanitarian
mission.
actors in the
La
exercise
France
of their
soutient le
difficult
projet de
missions.
déclaration
France
présidentielle
supports the
porté
draft
par les États-Unis et l'en
presidential
remercie.
statement put forward by
Je
the
vous
United
remercie.
States and thanks them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
le agradezco por convocar
I thank
este
you for
debate
convening
y
this debate.
agradezco a los expositores
I also thank the
por sus
briefers
valiosas ponencias.
for their valuable
El
statements.
Ecuador se suma al discurso
Ecuador
que pronunciará la
aligns
delegación de
itself
Irlanda
with the statement that
a
is
nombre
to
del
be
Grupo
delivered
de
by the
Amigos
Delegation of Ireland on
de
behalf
Acción
of
sobre
the
el
Group of
Conflicto y el Hambre
Friends on
que
Action on
copresidimos.
Conflict and Hunger that we
¿Cuánto le costó a este Consejo adoptar en
How hard
2018
was it for this council
la
to
resolución
adopt Resolution
2417
2417
sobre
in
hambre y
2018
conflicto?
on hunger and conflict?
Hoy se trata de una herramienta
Today,
valiosa de
it is
alerta
now
temprana
a
y
valuable
respuesta.
tool for early warning and
Precisamente,
response.
mantuvimos la semana pasada un diálogo informal
Specifically, last
interactivo
week we held an
sobre riesgos de la
informal
seguridad
interactive
alimentaria
dialogue on the risks of
para considerar
food
la nota de
security
alerta
in order
sobre
to
la situación de
consider
riesgo
the
en Burkina
note,
Faso,
the white note
República
alerting
Democrática
to
del
the
Congo y Haití. Esperamos que la sesión de hoy sirva como una caja de resonancia para la movilización de esfuerzos y recursos de OCHA, el PMA, la FAO, los actores humanitarios y los donantes para aliviar la crisis en esos países. Pero ¿qué más podemos hacer como Consejo de Seguridad? No pretendemos que exista una receta genérica aplicable a todos los estados, pero la paz y la estabilidad son contextos indispensables. En el caso de Haití, con la resolución 2692 del pasado 14 de julio, abarcamos las principales recomendaciones de OCHA. El Consejo instó a todas las partes, incluidas aquellas con capacidad para influir en los grupos armados, que tomen medidas para que no se sigan bloqueando las carreteras necesarias para establecer, para abastecer los mercados locales y que paren los daños a las fuentes de alimentos, cultivos del ganado o suministros médicos. Se tomaron en cuenta también las necesidades de acceso humanitarios seguro, rápido y sin trabas. Hoy saludamos la adopción de la declaración de la presidencia que también recoge esas recomendaciones. Por supuesto, esperamos que haya el suficiente acompañamiento para que se implementen en el terreno. El despliegue de una fuerza especializada de apoyo a la policía haitiana favorecerá los esfuerzos en Haití. La seguridad es indispensable, pero no suficiente, por lo que simultáneamente debemos avanzar en la implementación de otras estrategias que requieren de la cooperación de los donantes para Haití en el ámbito socioeconómico. Señoras y señores, como con más de 250 millones de personas que desde 2022 padecen de hambre aguda, en un tercio de los miembros de esta organización, enfocarnos en la seguridad alimentaria es central. Más aún cuando la mayoría de esos casos involucran escenarios de crisis y violencia armada. Reiteramos la obligación de todas las partes de hacer todo lo posible para garantizar el buen funcionamiento de los sistemas y mercados de alimentación, protegiendo los bienes de producción, almacenamiento y distribución de alimentos, así como el abastecimiento de agua. El Consejo debe asegurar el cumplimiento de la resolución 2573 sobre la protección de bienes esenciales, copatrocinada por el Ecuador en el 2021. Reiteramos así la prohibición de atacar, destruir, sustraer o inutilizar los bienes agrícolas y las cosechas. Condenamos cualquier práctica de hacer parecer hambre a la población como una táctica de guerra y cualquier bloqueo o agresión contra los proveedores de asistencia humanitaria. Si sabemos de cerca que cerca de hasta 25,000 personas mueren por hambre cada día, entonces, ¿cuántas personas han fallecido por hambre aguda en este quinquenio? ¿Cuántas personas perdieron la vida por falta de alimentos? Desde el debate de este Consejo de marzo de 2021 o desde mayo de 2022. ¿Cuántos desde el debate sobre protección de civiles hace solo 3 meses? ¿Y cuántos desde el inicio de la sesión de hoy? Pero también debemos ser capaces de preguntarnos cuántas vidas las Naciones Unidas y este Consejo salvaron. ¿Qué estamos haciendo para evitar que más países caigan en riesgo de hambruna? En abril del año pasado, el Ecuador albergó la Conferencia Regional de la FAO para América Latina y el Caribe.
In April last year, Ecuador hosted the regional conference of the FAO for Latin America and the Caribbean due to the concern over the increasing level of hunger and food insecurity in my region and the world. We reiterate the need to restore the Black Sea Grain Initiative and to establish other mechanisms that will allow us to avoid deterioration of global food insecurity. Similarly, trade in fertilizers, seeds and other agricultural inputs should not suffer restrictions.
que se profundicen los
we
esfuerzos de
must
todos los
drive
órganos y
deeper
agencias del sistema de
efforts
Naciones
by
Unidas
all organs and
y de los
agencies
Estados
of the UN
miembros
system and by
para que
member
podamos
states
pasar la página de una humanidad
in order for us
en
to
la
turn
cual
the
el
page
gasto militar
over a chapter of
alcanza
humanity
los
in
2
which
billones de dólares
military
y
spending reaches
de la
$2
producción de
trillion
alimentos
and
saludables se
1/3
desperdicia,
of the production of
mientras
healthy
niñas
food
y
is
niños
wasted.
ingieren galletas de tierra y
Meanwhile,
barro.
boys and girls
Muchas
are
gracias.
eating mud cookies. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me start by welcoming you and your team to the Security Council presidency and thank the US presidency for bringing the issue of food insecurity back to this council following Security Council Resolution 2417. I also want to thank Rina Galani, David Miliband and Naveen Salam for bringing your expertise and, critically, your proposals for action to the Council. Since 2021, as we've all heard, the number of people facing acute food insecurity has skyrocketed from 193 million to over 250 million today. And as we've heard, conflict is the main driver. Last week, the Council met to discuss the UN's warning on rapidly deteriorating food security in Haiti, DRC, and Burkina Faso. The message was clear: act now to prevent further deterioration. So in that spirit, I want to join others in focusing on actions and propose 3. They overlap with those that have been proposed by others during the course of our debate, and in particular with those proposed by the United Nations Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator. First, this Council should take concerted action to tackle the drivers of conflict and invest in inclusive, sustainable peace. The Secretary-General's new agenda for peace calls for renewed multilateral cooperation and putting women who are uniquely impacted by food insecurity at the centre of peace initiatives. In Afghanistan, if they cannot bear to watch their children die, some mothers face a harrowing choice: sell their children or starve. Congolese women in displacement camps are forced into sex work just to buy food. Second, we call on parties to conflict to abide by international humanitarian law and to allow humanitarians rapid and unimpeded access to people in need. In Sudan and Somalia, starving communities are surrounded by fighting, and humanitarians cannot reach them with food. International humanitarian law is our greatest defence against hunger in armed conflict, and those who violate it should be held to account. Finally, we need to protect global food systems. The Black Sea Grain Initiative got nearly 33 million tonnes of grain into world markets. Russia's decision to end the initiative has raised food prices, hitting the world's hungriest people. Russia's offer to give 50,000 tonnes of grain to each of 6 countries will not bring grain prices back down, nor help those facing famine in other countries. This inadequate gesture falls far short of solving the global problem that Russia has created. And let's be clear, UK, US and EU sanctions do not target food and fertiliser. They target Russia's war machine. As South Africa's President Ramaphosa said, the Black Sea should be open. We call on Russia to rejoin the BSGI immediately. Madam President, we know what we need to do to stop these soaring levels of hunger. Let's now turn that into action. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель.
Thank you, Madam President.
Благодарим координатора ООН по
We thank
предотвращению
UN
голода,
Famine Prevention and
реагированию
Response
Рину Гиляни
Coordinator
за доклад.
Rina Gilani for her briefing.
Выслушали представителей НПО,
We
выступивших по
also listened
предложению
to
Соединенных
civil
Штатов
society
Америки.
representatives who spoke at the suggestion of the United States.
Тема сегодняшнего заседания
The topic of
борьба с
today's
голодом,
meeting,
безусловно,
fighting
крайне
hunger,
важна.
is, of course, extremely important.
Россия, как и ранее
Russia,
СССР,
just as the USSR
уделяет ей
before it,
приоритетное внимание.
attaches great priority to this
Причем
issue,
исторически не
and
просто в привязке к
historically not
конкретным
just in
конфликтам,
connection with
а в
specific
более широком
conflict, but in the
контексте
broader
борьбы
context
за
of
социально-экономические
the
права
struggle
человека.
for socioeconomic
Усилия
rights.
Советского Союза на этом направлении с
The
благодарностью
efforts of the
помнят во
Soviet
многих
Union in this
регионах мира.
area are remembered with gratitude in many regions of the world.
Отрадно, что и наши западные коллеги
I'm
начали
pleased that our
задумываться об
Western
этой теме.
colleagues have also begun
Но,
to think
как
about
ясно
this
из
problem,
прозвучавших
but
выступлений,
as their statements
их
make
интерес, к
clear,
сожалению, носит
their
исключительно
interest
конъюнктурный
is
характер.
unfortunately purely opportunistic.
Угрозой мирового голода они озаботились только с
They
недавних пор.
have become concerned
И
about
лишь
the threat
поскольку
of world hunger
эту
only
тему
recently, and
можно
only
попробовать,
insofar
по их
as
мнению,
they
эксплуатировать
think
для
they can
очернения
attempt to
России.
exploit this topic to demonize Russia.
Более того, для нас очевидно,
Moreover,
что многие,
it is
причем
clear to
наиболее
us
острые из
that
кризисных продовольственных ситуаций,
many, and
прямо
in
или
fact the
косвенно
most acute
спровоцированные
food
действиями
crises
США
are
и их
directly or indirectly
союзников,
provoked by
или
the
являются
actions of the
последствиями
US and
их
their
многолетней
allies
политики.
or the consequences of their long-term policies.
К примеру, Афганистан,
For
о
example,
котором говорила наша британская коллега.
Afghanistan, which was mentioned
Вот
by
уже 20 лет не
our
может
UK
выбраться из пучины
colleague,
голода и
is
нищеты
struggling to climb out
из-за
of the abyss of
экспериментов,
hunger and
ведомой
poverty for
США
over 20
коалиции
years
по
now because of the
демократизации
experiments
на Западный
carried
лад
out by the
этой
US-led
страны с
coalition
глубоко
to
традиционным укладом.
democratize this deeply traditional country in a
Несмотря на
Western
то, что у
fashion.
наших коллег, западных членов Совета
Despite the fact
Безопасности, не
that
хватило
our
смелости
colleagues, the
честно назвать
Western
первопричины
members of the
продовольственных
Security
и
Council,
других
did not have
кризисов
the courage
в таких
to
странах, как
honestly
Ирак,
name the
Ливия и
root
Сирия,
causes of food and
все
other
мы прекрасно
crises in
понимаем,
countries such as
что
Iraq,
они
Libya, and
вызваны
Syria.
незаконными
We all
интервенциями
understand
западных
full well that
государств.
they are caused by illegal interventions by
В
Western
случае Сирии,
states.
которая
In
когда-то
the case of
кормила
Syria,
хлебом многих своих
which was
соседей,
once a breadbasket
США до
for
сих
many
пор
of its
оккупируют
neighbors, the
значительные
U.S.
районы
is still
этого
occupying
государства,
large swaths of
воруя
this
нефть,
country and
зерно
stealing
и другие
oil,
природные
grain,
ресурсы.
and other natural resources.
Как бы то ни было, уважаемые коллеги,
Whatever the
предлагаю
case
для
may
начала
be, dear
разобраться с
colleagues,
коренными причинами
I
угроз
propose that we
продовольственной
begin by
безопасности,
addressing the root
о
causes
которых наши
of
западные
threats to
коллеги
food
скромно
security, which
умалчивают.
our Western colleagues are bashfully silent
По
about.
оценкам ООН, технически
According to
острой
UN
нехватки
estimates,
продовольствия в мире нет.
technically, there is no
То есть
acute
дело
food
не в том,
shortage
что
in the
его мало.
world. That is, the problem
Продовольствия
isn't
в
that
мире
there isn't enough
производится
food.
достаточно.
There is enough food produced in the
Проблема в его
world.
неравномерном
The
распределении,
problem is its
когда на
uneven
Западе накоплены
distribution
избыточные
when
запасы,
the West has
а в
accumulated
развивающихся
excess
государствах
stocks while
дефицит.
developing countries have a deficit.
Вторая причина – это то,
second
что
reason
экономисты называют ценовой
Is what
конъюнктурой.
economists call the
Проще
price
говоря, когда
environment. In other
крупнейшим
words,
производителям
when
агропромышленной
it
продукции
benefits the
выгодно
largest
поддерживать
producers
высокие
of
цены на
agroindustrial
нее.
products to maintain prices high.
Речь идет о так называемой большой
We
четверке.
are talking
Это
about the
американские
so-called Big
компании
Four, the
Archer
U.S.
Daniels
companies
Midland, Bunch
Archer
и
Daniels,
Cargill,
Midland, Bunch,
а
and
также
Cargill, as
нидерландская
well
Louis
as
Dreyfus,
the Dutch company
на долю
Louis
которых
Dreyfus.
приходится от
They
75 до
account for
90%
75
глобального
to
торгового
90%
оборота
of
товаров АПК.
global agricultural trade.
В 2022 финансовом году одна только
In
корпорация
fiscal
Cargill
year
нарастила объемы
2022,
продаж
Cargill
на
alone increased
23%,
sales by
до
23%
165
to
миллиардов долларов,
$165 billion,
зафиксировав рекордную чистую
posting
прибыль в 5
a
миллиардов
record
долларов.
$5 billion net income.
Уважаемые коллеги, а теперь давайте зададимся
Dear
вопросом,
colleagues, and now let us
почему на
ask
фоне
ourselves
сверхприбыли
why,
западного
as
АПК
the Western agro-industrial
угроза
complex is
голода
raking in
больнее всего
super
бьет по
profits, the threat of
развивающимся
famine
государствам с
is hitting
растущим
developing
населением?
countries with growing
Почему
populations
их
the most?
экономика с ней не справляется?
Why are their economies unable to
очень
cope with
прост.
it? The answer is very
Западные
simple.
колонизаторы в прошлом
In the
сознательно
past,
затачивали
Western
их
colonialists
для
deliberately
извлечения
tailored
максимальной
them to
выгоды для
extract
метрополии,
maximum
а не
profits
для
for their
того,
empires,
чтобы
and
они были
not so
способны
that they would be able to feed their populations.
Им была навязана монокультурная
Monocultural agricultural
сельскохозяйственная
specialization was forced upon them, with the results that their exports now often consist of one or two types of goods.
Подобная структура экономики
This economic
обуславливает
structure
их
makes them
чрезвычайную зависимость от
extremely
колебаний цен на мировых
sensitive to
продовольственных
price
рынках.
fluctuations in global food
А
markets.
нынешняя нестабильность
And the
на
current
них обусловлена
instability in those
тем, что
markets is
западные
due to the
государства в
fact
период
that
пандемии
during the
коронавируса
COVID-19
бросили
pandemic,
спасать свои
Western states rushed to save their own
экономики, совершенно не
economies,
заботясь о том,
not caring
как
one
их
bit about
необдуманные
how their
действия
rash actions in the
финансово-экономической,
financial, economic,
энергетической и
and
других
energy,
сферах
as well as other
ударят по
sectors,
более
would
уязвимым
hit
участникам
more
мировой
vulnerable
экономики.
actors in the global economy.
Коллеги, год назад, реагируя
Colleagues,
на
1 year
призывы
ago,
ООН,
in
мы,
response to the appeals of the
несмотря на
UN,
имевшиеся сомнения,
we put
согласились
aside
на
our
зерновую
doubts
сделку.
and agreed to a grain deal.
Однако западные страны и здесь
But
умудрились
here
вывернуть все в
too,
свою пользу.
Western countries have managed to turn everything in their
Одна из
favor.
двух частей
One of the
сделки,
two parts of the
Черноморская
deal, the
инициатива,
Black Sea
из
Initiative,
гуманитарной
quickly
очень быстро
turned from
стала
a
коммерческой.
humanitarian one into a commercial one.
Нуждающиеся страны в итоге поступило
As a
лишь
result,
3%
only
экспортированного
3% of
зерна.
the exported grain went to
Львиная же
countries
его
in
доля
need,
попала в
while
западные
the lion's
государства.
share ended up in Western
Разве об
countries.
этом мы договаривались?
Is this what we agreed to?
Двуличие наших бывших западных
The
партнеров еще
duplicity of
более
our
четко
former Western
проявилось
partners
в
was
их
even more
высокомерном
clear
нежелании выполнять
in their
вторую часть
arrogant
зерновой
unwillingness
сделки.
to fulfill the
Меморандум
second part of the
России-ООН по
deal, the
поставкам
Russia-UN
российских
memorandum
продовольствий и
on the
удобрений
supply
на
of Russian
мировые
food and
рынки.
fertilizers to world
И это при
markets.
том, что доля России
And
на
this is
мировом
despite
рынке
the fact
пшеницы
that Russia's share of the
20%,
global wheat
Украины
market
менее
is
5%.
20%, while Ukraine's is less
А
than
это значит, что
5%.
Россия вносит
This
существенный
means
вклад
that
в
Russia
глобальную
makes a
продовольственную
significant
безопасность,
contribution to
является
global food
солидным,
security
ответственным международным
and is a
поставщиком
solid, responsible
сельхозпродукции.
international
Не
supplier
говоря
of
уже про
agricultural
исключительную роль
products.
российских удобрений для
Not to
глобальной
mention
продовольственной
the
безопасности.
exceptional role played by Russian fertilizers in global
Казалось
food
бы, с учетом
security.
этих очевидных
It would
фактов,
seem that given
западным
these
странам
obvious
необходимо
facts, Western countries
сконцентрироваться на
need to
том,
focus
чтобы
on
российское зерно и
ensuring that
удобрения
Russian grain and
беспрепятственно попадали в
fertilizers can get
нуждающиеся
to
страны.
countries in need without hindrance.
Однако планы
Yet,
наших западных коллег это не
this is
входит,
not
что
part
позавчера
of our Western
недвусмысленно
colleagues'
подтвердили
plans.
вы,
This was
госпожа председатель.
unambiguously confirmed by you the day before yesterday, Madam
Так,
President.
о каком тогда стремлении вашей
So
страны
how can we
решать
talk about
вопросы
any kind of
международной
desire on your
продовольственной
country's part
безопасности
to
может идти
address
речь?
international food security
Все,
issues?
что вами движет, это
All that
стремление
drives you
наказать
is the desire to
Россию
punish Russia
и ваши несбыточные мечты
and your
нанести
pipe dreams of
стратегическое
dealing it a
поражение.
strategic defeat.
А на интересы стран глобального юга вам
You do
совершенно
not care the
наплевать.
slightest bit about the interests
нет.
of the countries of the global south. But
Поэтому
we
еще раз
do.
повторяю, что если
Therefore,
все
I repeat once
обозначенные нами
again
публично, в
that
том
if
числе
all
в
the
этом зале,
problems
проблемы,
that have been
возникшие
publicly
с
raised by
реализацией
us, including
меморандума
in this
России и
chamber
ООН,
regarding the
будут устранены,
implementation of the Russia-UN
мы
memorandum are
готовы будем
eliminated,
вернуться к
we
участию
will
в
be
Черноморской
ready to once
инициативе.
again take part in the Black Sea Initiative.
Уважаемые коллеги, западные
Dear
делегации
colleagues,
сегодня буквально сыпали
Western
цифрами
delegations
помощи,
today poured forth
оказываемой ими
numbers detailing the
развивающимся странам.
humanitarian aid rendered by them to
Достаточно ли
developing
этого для
countries?
компенсации ущерба, нанесенного веками жестокой
Whether
колониальной
this is
политики,
enough to
разграбления
compensate for the
природных
damage
богатств
caused
и
by
эксплуатации
centuries
населения.
of cruel
Это
colonial
судить не нам, а
policies
тем
of plundering
государствам,
natural
которые от нее
resources and exploiting
пострадали.
populations is not for us to judge,
Много ли
but
помогают
rather for those
страны
states that
Запада
have suffered
или
from
мало?
it. Do Western countries help a
Чужие
lot
деньги, конечно, считать
or a
нехорошо,
little?
однако сложно не
It's not
заметить,
polite
что
to
объемы,
count other
оказываемые США
people's
и их
money, but it's hard
союзниками
not to
странам
notice
глобального
that the
юга
amount of
помощи
assistance provided by the U.S. and
не
its
идут ни в
allies to
какое
the countries
сравнение
of the
с тем,
global
что
south
Запад менее
cannot be
чем за 2 года
compared to what
выделил
the
на
West has
оружие
spent
для
on
военной
weapons
подоверенности с Россией
in less
до
than 2
последнего
years for its
украинца.
proxy war with Russia to the last
По самым
Ukrainian.
скромным подсчетам, это
According to the
80
most
миллиардов
conservative
евро.
estimates, this amounts
Общая же
to
сумма
80
выделенных
billion
Украине
euros, while the
средств
total amount of
165
funds
миллиардов
allocated to
евро.
Ukraine is 165
И это при
billion
том, что на
euros.
все гумоперации на
And this is
2023
given
год
that
у КГВ ООН запросил у доноров
OCHA requested
$55,2 миллиарда
$55.2
долларов.
billion
И на настоящий момент
from
выделено
donors for
всего
all of its
24,8%
humanitarian operations for
от этой
2023, and
суммы.
only 24.8% of this amount has been
Представляете,
funded
сколько
to
всего
date.
хорошего
Can you
можно
imagine how
было бы
much
сделать в
good
мире,
could be done in
если
the
бы
world
США и их
if
союзники
the U.S.
тратили
and its
деньги на
allies
содействие
were
развитию с
as
такой же
willing to spend
готовностью,
money on
с какой
development
они
assistance
спонсируют
as they
войны по
are
всему
on
миру?
sponsoring wars around the world.
Но сейчас я хочу обратить внимание на другое.
But now I want to draw
Несмотря на все
attention to
благие
something
лозунги,
else. Despite all of their
донорская
benevolent
помощь западных
slogans,
стран не бескорыстна и
donor
всегда
assistance from
обставлена
Western states is
политическими
not
предусловиями.
selfless and always comes with political
Наглядный пример
preconditions. A
ситуации с
clear
механизмом
example of this
трансграничной
is the
помощи
situation with the
Сирии,
cross-border
когда западные страны
humanitarian
фактически
mechanism
открыто
for
шантажируют
Syria, where
сирийский
Western
народ,
states
добиваясь
are
смены власти.
essentially openly blackmailing the
Другой
Syrian
пример,
people
раздающийся
seeking a
сейчас
change of
угрозы
power.
Жозепа Борреля, а также
Another
руководству
example
Великобритании,
is the
Франции и
threats we're
США
hearing now from Josep
прекратить
Borrell, as well as the
помогать
leadership
Нигеру.
of the UK, France, and the US to
Там что,
stop
люди в
helping
одночасье
Niger.
перестали
Did
голодать
people
после
suddenly stop
переворота?
starving there after the coup?
То есть очевидно, что вся эта
It's
помощь
obvious, in other words,
используется
that all
Западом
of this
исключительно как
humanitarian aid is
инструмент
being used
ручного
by the West
управления
solely as a tool
государствами,
of
которые
control
вынуждены к ней
over
прибегать.
states that are forced to resort to it.
Потребности же нуждающегося населения при этом во
The
внимание не
needs
принимаются.
of the population are not taken into
Уважаемые
account
коллеги
in
из
this.
развивающихся стран,
Dear colleagues from developing countries, make no mistake, the habits and methods of former colonizers have not changed. Only the packaging has. For every dollar allegedly spent on aid, they will demand that you pay with your sovereignty and political independence. Many African states have already experienced this firsthand and don't want to put up with such an approach. And this is something that makes Mr. Borrell lose sleep in his garden. He suddenly decided today that selling grain at low prices, Russia somehow making its buyers dependent. I won't comment on the perverted logic of the head of EU diplomacy. I will simply say that the facts are not in its favor. Russia has never considered Africa, Asia, or Latin America as a space for extracting profits. Despite all of the obstacles put in place by the U.S. and its allies, we have helped, are helping, and will continue to help those in need around the world free of charge. We have built and will continue building factories, schools, hospitals, and universities so that you can use your natural resources to create goods with added value instead of exporting raw materials, so that your young people can stay home rather than leaving the country en masse. We understand the importance of the uninterrupted supply of food to African countries. This is important for socioeconomic development and for maintaining political stability. That is why we're particularly focused on shipments of wheat, barley, corn, and other grains to our African friends, including through the UN World Food Program. Last year, trade in agricultural products between Russia and African countries grew by 10% and amounted to $6.7 billion, whereas in the first 6 months of this year, it has increased by another record 60%. Russia exported 11.5 million tons of grain to Africa in 2022, and just in the first 6 months of this year, we have already exported nearly 10 million. And I want to stress that this has all taken place despite the illegal unilateral sanctions imposed on our exports, which seriously impede the supply of Russian food and complicate transportation, logistics, insurance, and bank payments. Moreover, as announced at the recent Russia-Africa summit, we will be able to provide Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea with 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain free of charge in the coming months, and we will ensure the free delivery of this as well. I also recall our readiness to donate mineral fertilizers to the poorest countries in need. Of the 262,000 tons of these fertilizers that are currently blocked in European ports, only 2 shipments have been sent so far, 20,000 tons to Malawi and 34,000 to Kenya. The rest remains in the hands of European states. And this is despite the fact that we're talking about a purely humanitarian effort to which no sanctions should apply in principle. Dear colleagues, we believe that the vast majority of countries, including African ones, which are seeing an alarming trend in the area of food security, have sufficient fertile lands. That is, there is a foundation there for building food sovereignty, and it must be strengthened not through humanitarian aid, but through the implementation of projects in the area of sustainable development as a whole, the transfer of necessary technologies, fertilizers, weather-resistant seeds. We are convinced that with the use of appropriate agricultural technologies and proper organization of agricultural production, Africa will, in the future, not only be able to feed itself and ensure its own food security, but also become an exporter of various types of food. For its part, Russia is ready to share its expertise with African states and other interested developing countries in the area of agricultural production and assist in implementing cutting-edge technologies. Unlike Western neo-colonialists, we're interested in building a more equitable system of resource distribution so that developing states are not forever hooked on the needle of politically conditioned humanitarian aid from the West, which is nothing other than primitive blackmail. This is so that they can overcome the challenges of the transitional period, form strong, sustainable, self-sufficient economies which can help ensure social stability and the well-being of the population. In other words, this will give them complete freedom in exercising their sovereignty and making all domestic and foreign policy decisions. Russia is ready to help you with this in every possible way. Madam President, we note the work carried out by our American colleagues in advance of today's meeting to agree on a statement by the President of the Security Council on Hunger and Conflicts. Despite the fact that this document did not end up incorporating all the provisions we proposed, we considered it possible to support it in the spirit of compromise. The consequences of illegitimate unilateral restrictive measures and sanctions that have a direct negative impact on food security in the world have been left out of the document. It would have also been appropriate to recall paragraph 3 of Article 54 of the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, according to which the prohibitions on attacking or destroying agricultural infrastructures do not apply if such infrastructure is used as sustenance for the members of the armed forces or in direct support of military action. During today's debate, the representative of Venezuela will speak on behalf of the group of friends of the UN Charter. We associate ourselves with this statement, which reflects in a much fuller way the approach to solving problems that are a focus of our meeting today. Madam President, in conclusion, I wish to say that because the importance of Russian food and fertilizers is so great for the socioeconomic development and food security of the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, the choice now lies with you and your allies until the illegitimate obstacles artificially created by the West affecting Russian economic operators' ability to supply agricultural products are eliminated, it will hardly be possible to restore the normal functioning of supply chains and address other global food security issues. No matter how much you may try to shift the blame to Russia, the facts are not in your favor. So you must therefore decide what is more important for the U.S. and its allies, geopolitical considerations or the desire to help the developing world. If it's the former, then there is no need to mislead anyone, including by initiating debates like today's and drawing up beautiful joint documents. What we need is not words, but actions. We have been and remain ready to participate in joint efforts to strengthen international food security. Are you? We have serious doubts about that. Thank you.
I thank the Russian Federation for their statement. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the collars of the microphones will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Vahi Javargan, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Armenia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I would like to express my appreciation to the United States for convening this open debate on such a pertinent topic. I thank Ms. Rina Ghalani, UN Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator, and other distinguished briefers for presenting their views on the ways to prevent and address famine by strengthening the food security in conflict situations. Starvation has been repeatedly used as a method of warfare and perpetration of genocide throughout history. But today I am not going to recall examples from the past or assess future risks of famine in the context of the conflict. Instead, I would like to bring to the attention of the Council a situation which is happening right now, situation wherein people do not know whether today they will be able to find milk formula for their babies, loaf of bread for their children, or provide medicines to critically ill relatives. As we meet, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh face threat to their very existence resulting from the complete blockade imposed by Azerbaijan. For more than 7 months, Azerbaijan continues to block the Lachin corridor, a humanitarian lifeline connecting Nagorno-Karabakh with the outside world. This illegal and inhumane action is in blatant violation of the order of International Court of Justice of 22 February 2023, reaffirmed by July 6 order. Norms of international humanitarian law and the trilateral statement of 9 November 2020. The complete halt of any humanitarian supplies by Azerbaijan since 15 June this year has led to a critical shortage of food, medical supplies, and other essential goods, creating a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. Disruption of electricity and gas supplies has been paralyzing social and healthcare services and transportation system, depriving the besieged population of their fundamental human rights. The blockade has a particular devastating impact on the most vulnerable segments of the population. Due to the lack of essential foods and vitamins, approximately 2,000 pregnant women, around 30,000 children, 20,000 elder persons, and 9,000 persons with disabilities are struggling to survive under conditions of malnutrition, absence of basic supplies and medicines. Moreover, Azerbaijan continuously targets civilians conducting agricultural works, augmenting its manifest intent to impose starvation on the population. These warning signs have already been communicated by the ICRC, which remains the only international humanitarian mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. In its July 25 news release, the International Committee of the Red Cross expressed concern of a growing humanitarian needs and emphasized that it's not currently able to bring humanitarian assistance to the civilian population.